Hey there everybody, welcome to Tech Tuesday. I'm Rick Husey, I'll be right back. Hey, thanks for joining me. I'm Rick Husey here with Zcorum, and it's Tuesday and it's 3 o'clock, which means it's Tech Tuesday. I do this every week. And today I'm going to be talking about rural broadband and rural broadband funding, something which has been in the news a lot lately. And being as we're a company that services rural broadband providers, that's also of interest to us. But I was going to go through some news on that, and it's been of great interest both in the news as well as just in general because of the pandemic and what we've seen as the need for this. So first off, let's talk about kind of the state of things. This was a story that just came out the other day that says rural fiber penetration at 23%. Almost 1/3 of rural customers seek faster broadband. So obviously, again, with the pandemic, a lot of people have noticed their broadband at home is maybe not what it should be, not up to what it needs to be. This was especially when a lot of people were working at home and you had kids in school at home, people trying to do Zoom meetings, both for business and school. So, and not to mention entertainment value and those kinds of things. So rural broadband or fiber penetration now stands at 23% according to the study. The 23% rural fiber penetration is a little more than half the national average. Reported in 2019, the average was about 42%. What is that? In 2019 was about 42%, indicating there's significant work to do to increase rural fiber penetration. So I think overall what they're saying is 42%, but rural is 23%. So there does need to be more effort put into rural broadband. So cable broadband penetration leads all access technologies in rural America at 39%. And you can see why that would be, with cable operators having been providing cable in those areas for a long period of time. And even though telephone companies were out in some rural areas, their first methodology to deploy broadband was DSL. So fiber was later to the table there. DSL ranked at 14%, followed by fixed wireless at 10%, and satellite broadband at 6%. Roughly 8% of rural households are using their cell phone plan for internet access, so they don't have any wired connection at all, or even a fixed wireless. Fixed wireless and satellite broadband penetration in rural markets will be interesting numbers to watch in the coming years as RDOF and other government-sponsored programs are funding growth for these access technologies in underserved and unserved markets. So that's true. You've got SpaceX now, Starlink coming out. We'll talk about another satellite provider that's been launching satellites here recently. And then you've got more fixed wireless opportunities coming out with some of the mid-band spectrum that's been auctioned off for both CRBS and CBRS, and C-band spectrum that's been auctioned off. Fiber broadband has the highest satisfaction among rural internet subscribers at 8.1 on a 10-point scale, where 10 indicates completely satisfied. And again, you can see why fiber tends to be very reliable. Once it's in the ground, there's not a lot that can go wrong unless it's cut. If it's put in properly, you can have issues obviously that crop up, but compared to other wired technologies where you've got analog signals, or you've got RF issues, wireless kind of propagation issues, you can see where fiber would be very solid. Surprisingly, fixed wireless was rated second after fiber broadband at 7.9. The average satisfaction rating was 7.6. DSL is underperforming at 7.1. And here you can see this is the percentage of market share, I guess, if you would, in these rural areas. So again, you've got cable at 39%, fiber 23%, DSL at 14%, and then you see fixed wireless at 10%, cell phone only at 8%, and satellite at 6%. And again, expect to see the satellite number, especially for rural broadband areas that don't have good wired service, expect to see that climb significantly here in the next year with Starlink as well as OneWeb, which we'll talk about here in a minute. And then fixed wireless as well, because you've got, again, a lot of operators that are deploying 5G service using mid-band spectrum, even low-band spectrum. But I think mid-band spectrum, you'll be seeing that in a lot of rural areas as well, where they don't have good access to a wired service. Most rural consumers are satisfied with their current broadband speed, but close to 1/3 indicate they would like to see faster speeds. 49% of rural households are now streaming, including 68% of 18 to 34-year-olds. So that's been a big change probably in the last year to 2 years, as more and more people are streaming. As we've had more streaming services out there. We had Netflix, obviously, and Amazon Prime, but we've, got the addition of Disney Plus, Discovery Plus, HBO Max, CBS All Access now, Paramount Plus. So all of these new streaming services are out, as well as YouTube TV, Hulu TV. So there's been a lot of streaming in the last few years that have come on board. Other key findings from the study, which surveyed over 800 rural internet subscribers, and these are all interesting if you are a rural internet provider, or really any broadband provider. Access to local channels and bundling internet are users' top 2 reasons for staying with their current TV provider. So a lot of people have been cutting the cord, but access to local channels is important. So that's one reason why they might not completely cut the cord from the cable company. They like those local channels, as well as sports, but local is important. Close to a half of rural customers bundle internet and TV, so people do like bundles. So if you can provide them with a discount, getting their internet and their TV, that can help, especially considering the rise in prices of some of these video services as you cut the cord. So a lot of people cut the cord, and they might have gotten a service provider like Hulu or YouTube at $45, and now that's up to $65. So those price increases can make a difference. And if people are already having to pay for their broadband connection, and maybe when they cut the cord, their broadband price goes up because they're using more data, maybe bundling makes sense. So there's still a way to hold on to video customers if you're a broadband provider, and also a pay TV provider, like maybe a cable TV company or a telephone company. Just over a quarter of rural customers have managed Wi-Fi, and more than a third are interested in it. So again, if you are a broadband operator, that's good to know, because Wi-Fi can be a real pain for people. They like to know that they don't want to have to deal with it if it goes out, have to worry about, is it my router, what's going on? So they'd like to be able to call their ISP and get help with that, and maybe make that a managed service so that the ISP can look in on the device and see specific information about maybe the signal strength. Maybe they can change the channel for the customer. They can maybe remotely change the password or the SSID. So customers are interested in that, and a lot of them are willing to pay for that. So maybe you provide them with a device, and you can provide a managed Wi-Fi service on top of that. So good information there in that study. This is just now happening. So the FCC has released a lot of money for, this could be rural or anybody in an area where maybe they've had issues with getting their broadband paid for. It could be because they've lost their job, or it could be just they're in a low-income situation. So operators are lining up for this FCC broadband subsidy program. More than 300 fixed and mobile internet providers were approved to participate in the U.S. Federal Communications Emergency Broadband Benefit Program, and this is billions in government subsidies to low-income consumers. Big names in the mix include AT&T, Comcast, and Windstream, so they've stepped up and they're getting help there. Work is underway developing the systems necessary to enable consumers to sign up to receive subsidies. And this will provide a monthly discount on broadband service to eligible consumers, directly reimbursing operators for up to $50 per month per household, up to $75 per month if the household is on tribal lands. It will also fund a one-time discount of up to $100 on a computer or a tablet for eligible consumers. So they're trying to make it affordable. One of the issues with broadband, you can get broadband out to all these rural areas, but if it's an area where it's a low-income area, even though it's there, people may not be able to afford it. So they're trying to help that. And it's not just obviously these big carriers, it's also smaller operators as well that are stepping up to do this. And other big news here is the Biden infrastructure plan calls for a $100 billion broadband investment and an end to subsidies. So this is part of the American Jobs Plan that the administration is floating out there right now and trying to sell. Will invest more than $3 trillion by some accounts in a variety of infrastructure projects. That's $3 trillion. $3 trillion. That's a lot of dollars. How many dollars is that? Well, what is a trillion? So if you had $3 trillion, let's say you had $3 trillion and you could spend $1 million an hour. How many hours? How long would it take you to do that? Just think about that in your mind a second. How long, if you could spend $1 million an hour, how long would it take you to spend $3 trillion? Well, here's the answer. You could spend $1 million an hour, 24 hours a day, 24 hours a day, $1 million an hour for 432 years. That's how much $1 trillion is. It's amazing that we can spend that kind of money. So you could be, basically, $1 trillion is it's $1,000 billion. So you could be a billionaire 1,000 times over. So again, 432 years, if you could do that, obviously you couldn't do that, you wouldn't be alive, but if you and your 10 or so generations of ancestors after you could do that, it would take that long. Assuming you were not smart enough to put that in some interest-bearing account that could, add to that amount, and who knows how long it would take. So a lot of money. The White House fact sheet about the infrastructure proposal referenced the 1936 Rural Electrification Act, which aimed to bring electricity infrastructure to rural America as a precedent for doing something similar today with broadband. So they're looking at this as, basically broadband. It says here, broadband internet is the new electricity. And there is something to be said about that, because when the power goes out, people are most concerned about the internet, and maybe that's it, right? So, as long as the refrigerator can stay cold for a while, they want to make sure they have their internet. So there's something to be said there. The plan does advocate for $100 billion in funding to build high-speed broadband infrastructure to reach 100% coverage that is future-proof. They don't give a lot of details in this plan. It's $100 billion. They don't talk a lot about how they're going to spend it. They don't talk about what future-proof is. A lot of people interpret that as gigabit broadband and two-way, up and down, which would be talking more about like maybe fiber broadband. It explicitly proposes that broadband networks owned, operated by, or affiliated with local governments, nonprofits, and cooperatives be given priority support. So it goes on specifically to cite removing barriers so rural electric cooperatives and municipalities can compete on an even playing field. So what they're saying is, if there are laws in place, and there are laws in various states and various cities, where, let's say, a municipality cannot get in the internet business. In some cases, I think in it's either North or South Carolina, for example, you just can't. And in other places, it says if there's not a provider, you can. So if there's not a provider in the area, then the city can get in the business. And then in plenty of states and cities, you can. But this is saying that it has to remove those barriers. And it's interesting that it says an even playing field, because one of the arguments against allowing this in certain situations, let's say if there are already providers in the area, is that it's not really an even playing field, because the city can get funds from taxpayers and a private business has to make a profit in order to stay in business. So is it really an even playing field if you did this? One of the more interesting proposals from the plan is an effort to reduce the cost of broadband, and we were just talking about the ability, that's already money that's already rolling out in another area. So this would probably have similar kinds of things. Reduce the cost of broadband and promote more widespread adoption. And one is to address broadband subsidies, presumably the Universal Service Fund. So this is saying take subsidies away, or at least maybe something like the Universal Service Fund, and that's that amount that you pay on your phone bill every month for USF fees that used to help fund rural telephone service. Now it's helping to fund rural broadband. Continually providing subsidies to cover the cost of overpriced internet service is not the right long-term solution for consumers or taxpayers. I don't know what it is. They don't say. The current USF program is under pressure, and some argue unsustainable in its present form because it relies on declining revenue from voice traffic. And again, USF started as a way to provide rural phone service, and it switched over to rural broadband, but we've seen declining revenue from traditional voice service, or even VoIP service from that. So they're saying it's really not sustainable. Your USF fee has been going up on your bill, and that's one reason why. And there are fans of this, and there are people that are against this $3 trillion infrastructure bill. And again, that's $100 billion of that would be broadband, but one of the reasons people are upset is because the vast majority of that really, they say, has nothing to do with infrastructure. But obviously broadband is infrastructure. A barrage of statements from broadband provider associations and think tanks followed the announcement, which, if adopted, would provide $100 billion in broadband support. Priority support to local governments, nonprofits, and cooperatives would remove barriers to rural electric cooperatives and municipalities. We talked about that. So there are people lined up on both sides for and against this. Cheers and jeers, as they say. So let's see a few. Let's see. One thing they're saying is this is reigniting war on the municipal broadband front again, where people are lining up on different sides on this. President Joe Biden wants to make it easier for cities to build and operate their own broadband networks in competition with companies like Comcast, Verizon, to expand internet access as part of a sweeping infrastructure bill. But it's not just those big providers like Comcast and Verizon. It could be small, local, independently owned cable companies, phone companies, wireless providers, fixed wireless, that kind of thing. It renews a partisan fight over whether government-owned broadband networks can provide an affordable high-speed internet alternative to private carriers. The president is proposing lifting barriers that prevent municipally owned or affiliated providers from competing on an even playing field with private providers. Some sites operate a fiber broadband network through a public site city. Sorry, I misread that. Some cities operate a fiber broadband network through a public utility, while other localities have partnered with private companies. And you see that a lot. The municipality can go ahead and do it all on their own, but a lot of them are partnering with local providers. So it could be a local phone company. Quite often it's a local phone company or some other entity like that they partner with that's already in the business, and they can provide some infrastructure there and some assistance. So the partisan divide, obviously, Democrats argue that municipal networks can play a crucial role in expanding service. About 4.4% of Americans continue to lack access to fixed broadband internet at the FCC's benchmark speeds, which is just 25 megabits per second down and 3 megabits per second up, according to data. Percentage of unserved households climbs to 17.3% in rural areas. State policies that impede the ability of municipalities to run their own networks take many forms. As I mentioned, Pennsylvania and Montana prohibit muni broadband in communities that are served by a commercial provider. Utah and North Carolina have requirements that, in effect, bar municipalities from providing internet service, so they can't at all. And here's the divide. So Democrats argue that lifting these laws would inject competition to private companies, lowering internet prices across the board and giving consumers more options. Republicans, who argue that taxpayer-funded broadband networks have an unfair competitive advantage over private companies, and question whether they really lower prices for consumers. So they're saying, again, that this is in competition basically to private companies, so you're kind of taking capitalism out of the mix there. And is it really lowering prices for consumers, because the consumers may have to pay taxes in order to help fund this. So your broadband bill may be lower, but then your taxes go up and maybe it's a wash. So this is talking about muni broadband here, but then there's also the EMCs, electric co-ops, and they are a really good fit for this because they have fiber generally, they've got poles, access, they cover big swaths of area outside of cities and towns, because that's really where the broadband gap is. You've got these, even in small municipalities, a lot of times you've got a incumbent provider, a local phone company or cable company that's providing really good service. But it's those areas outside of the city, outside of that service area, where sometimes there's not very much service. And that's where a EMC, maybe in partnership with other companies, can provide good service. So I think it would be good that you don't restrict municipalities and EMCs from getting in the business, but I think it also needs to be fair in that there needs to be a way to compete fairly with companies that are for-profit. And let's see what some of these statements are from various associations. You got the NRECA, and this is an association of electric utilities, electric co-ops specifically. And of course, you would expect, they say, we're encouraged to see electric co-op priorities reflected in President Biden's proposal as we plan for a future that depends on electricity as the primary energy source for a majority of the economic strategy investments, et cetera, et cetera. So as an association of EMCs, they're all for it. Then the opposite side of the spectrum, you've got the NCTA. This is an association of primarily larger cable operators, really all cable operators, but they tend to focus on the larger ones. Statement of Michael Powell, President and CEO, regarding this. He says, the White House is elected to go big on broadband infrastructure, but it risks taking a serious wrong turn and discarding decades of successful policy by suggesting that the government is better suited than private sector technologists to build and operate the internet. America's broadband has been a reliable workhorse as millions of Americans have worked, learned, and stayed connected from home during the pandemic. And that's true that a lot of these incumbent providers, cable, telephone, whatever, have really stepped up and provided great service where they have facilities, where they are serving people. The issue is where people are not served. The rapid innovation in internet technology and services that Americans have seen over the past 2 decades is the direct consequence of massive and continuing private investment in networks across the country. So again, he's talking about private investment versus public. Government does have a critical role to play in getting networks to areas that lack service and helping low-income families afford it. However, those targeted shared goals are not served by suggesting wrongly that the entire network is ailing and that the solution is either to prioritize government-owned networks or micromanage private networks, including the unfounded assertion that the government should be managing prices. And that sounds like kind of when they're talking about making everything affordable for all customers and they're not going to have subsidies, that sounds like maybe where they're trying to lean is having some kind of price management where ISPs can only charge a certain amount. So that's going to be difficult to do. Here's the U.S. Telecom Statement. They tried to be a little bit more nuanced here, take a softer approach. So this is they're the Broadband Association, leading association of connectivity providers. We share the administration's belief that connectivity for all is a national priority of the highest order, and our members, innovators that have been connecting the country for generations, are ready to go to work with government partners to build the remaining infrastructure to finally and fully connect every home and business in America. So they represent a lot of telephone companies, and obviously telephone companies have connected people for generations with telephone service and later broadband. And they're saying this has been something that's worked in the past. Let's remember this: our shared communications networks are backed by $1.8 trillion in private investment that helped the country navigate the depths of the pandemic with reliable and resilient connectivity. Then the NTCA, this is an association of smaller telephone companies. As community-based providers, so again, smaller, these tend to be located in the community. A lot of people live and work there. As community-based providers committed to serving their neighbors, NTCA members have led the charge in delivering high-quality broadband services that make your rural communities vibrant places to live, work, and go to school. I want to thank President Biden for recognizing the importance of broadband access. We've learned anything from the last year, it's that connections matter, broadband matters, and speed and capacity matter. Invest in efficient and scalable technologies like fiber. That's what they aim to do. They mentioned fiber because, again, these are phone companies. NTCA looks forward to continuing to work with the White House and policymakers to ensure that providers of all kinds who are committed to their communities can realize and then sustain a shared vision of broadband access for all. In other words, providers of all kinds, meaning our members, telephone companies, and not just municipalities and EMCs. So that's their statement. And you can see here that, again, their members are telephone companies, so they're talking about fiber. That's the future for them, and they are making a play for that. AT&T came out, and even though they're rolling out fiber everywhere, they said don't leave out 5G in all of this spending, and that's probably true, but I think they're going based on the future-proof statement in there, thinking that maybe they're talking about just fiber. There's a brewing battle over exactly how Biden should allocate all of that spending. Should he go full broadband and require that every government-funded connection support 1 gigabit per second connections, both up and down? Some former FCC officials argue this is the only way to future-proof Biden's spending because fiber is really the best future technology, but it may not really work in every area, and that's what they're saying here. Others argue that a good enough effort should be used in locations where gig connections would undoubtedly cost tens of thousands of dollars to deliver, at least in the beginning anyway. Fiber is the most future-proof approach, but it is commonly accepted that it is not practical to assume fiber can or should serve every household in rural America, wrote AT&T's Joan Marsh, EVP of the company's Federal Regulatory Relations. And AT&T has invested pretty heavily in C-band spectrum to do wireless, including 5G, so that's one reason they're bringing that up. And speaking of C-band, winning bidders, I think it was FCC. I know Verizon did. Winning bidders, long-form applications are acceptable for filing. So everybody that won a bid, their long-form applications have been reviewed and accepted. So this is C-band spectrum. This is mid-band spectrum. That's pretty fast. So this can provide very good speeds as far as broadband goes. All companies that had winning bids in the C-band spectrum auction have submitted long-form applications to the FCC and have been deemed acceptable. There's a possibility that the Commission could return or dismiss the applications if upon further examination they're found to be defective or not in compliance with the Commission's rules. So as things move on, if they realize that an operator is not doing what they're supposed to be doing, they can certainly pull that back. This particular auction raised a record-breaking $81 billion. Spectrum lies between 3.7 and 3.98 gigahertz and is considered mid-band spectrum. This is just above the CBRS spectrum. And this mid-band spectrum is the optimum mixture of speed and range for 5G. So the issues that you have with 5G is you've got low-band spectrum that T-Mobile was rolling out at first, and it's really not that much faster than 4G that you might get. You've got millimeter wave that Verizon was rolling out in urban areas, high-density areas, and while that's very, very fast, it doesn't propagate very far. It won't go through walls, won't go through trees. It's affected by the weather. So the nice thing about this mid-band range, mid-band spectrum, is it goes relatively far, it propagates fairly well, and it's got a pretty good, decent speed. So while it's not at gig speeds, I don't believe it's hundreds of megabits per second. Why did I have that up? Oh, this is talking about the bidders. So there were 57 qualified bidders in the auction, but only 21 ultimately won spectrum. Biggest winner was Verizon, accounting for half the money raised, but you can see some of the others here. There's Verizon under the name Cellco Partnership, but you can see you got AT&T in there. You do have Cellular South, you got Nextech, that's wireless, you got T-Mobile, US Cellular, but you've got some others. You got Ori Telephone right here in South Carolina. Then you've got LICT Group, wireless broadband, and that's a good example. I pulled them up here. So LICT is a group that owns several rural telephone companies. So you can see they own California, Oregon Telephone, Central Scott, Centricom, Giant Communications, here up in the Upper Peninsula telephone company right there. So this is a rural telephone company that provides broadband and phone service in a lot of hard-to-reach rural areas. So they are looking at C-band as one of the ways that they can expand broadband and a good quality broadband into these areas. National efforts to close the digital divide require local empowerment. So this is broadband communities. So obviously their focus is going to be on these municipalities. So their audience is municipalities and other communities that are rolling out broadband, as well as multi-family units, those kinds of things. Findings from a survey of more than 120 state and local leaders confirm a need for investment in broadband infrastructure nationwide and a new approach to funding deployment. Respondents hail from 18 states across the country, including localities that vote across the political spectrum, so Republican, Democrat. They represent small towns, big cities, state and local economic development and IT agencies, utility companies, nonprofit organizations, and educational institutions, many at different stages of implementing broadband plans. So some may be thinking about it, others may be laying the fiber, others may be already getting customers. 88% of respondents ranked fiber deployment among their community's highest priorities for investment. Beyond physical infrastructure, subscription, subsidies, digital literacy, and inclusion programs are the highest priority investments. Communities understand that closing the digital divide requires not only closing the infrastructure gap, but also the affordability and adoption gaps. So that's similar to what is in the Biden plan. The question is, how do they achieve that? But again, you can go ahead and get fiber everywhere in the country, but if people can't afford it, then it's not going to do them any good. That's what they're saying there. All right, this is very important for rural broadband. So OneWeb, a new satellite company from the UK, is going head-to-head with SpaceX's Starlink to provide global space broadband service. SpaceX rival OneWeb has expanded its constellation to 146 satellites. So they already have satellites in the air, 146 now. They just launched some recently. Launching thousands of satellites is not a responsible way forward for the next generations, is what they're saying. So their plans, as far as how many satellites they're going to put up, is much, much less than Elon Musk's as far as Starlink, and less than Amazon and what they are planning. The British-owned satellite broadband operator, which was rescued from bankruptcy by the UK government in November, wants to beam internet down to households and businesses across the world from satellites in orbit. It says down to households, but I think that's not correct based on what it said here later. Elon Musk is way ahead of OneWeb. It currently has around 1,300 satellites in orbit. It says at 550 550 kilometers in orbit. That's about 350 miles or so. And it plans to launch 42,000 by mid-2027. It's like you could walk across them in space, it seems like, with that many satellites. Now, whether they actually launch that many, I don't know, but already having 1,300 satellites up is pretty phenomenal. They've done that just over like 2 years. OneWeb plans to have 648 satellites at 1,200 kilometers in orbit to provide global service. So they're going higher, which means their latency is going to be a little bit higher, and maybe the speed will be less. Now, being in the vacuum of space, it won't impact latency probably that much, but the company's most recent launch on March 25th took it up to 146 satellites. Amazon founder Jeff Bezos hasn't launched any satellites yet, but aims to get a fleet of 3,236 in orbit in the near future for its Project Kuiper. Thursday's launch was the second out of 5 OneWeb launches this year to deliver internet coverage to the top of the globe down to the 50th degree latitude, according to McLaughlin. This includes Alaska, Canada, Greenland, Russia, the Nordic countries, and Northern Europe. Interesting that they didn't say the US, so maybe they're not getting that far south. The fifth launch will be in June, when OneWeb aims to provide broadband to the whole of the UK by mid-2022. Areas down to 21 degrees latitude will be covered, so that may be getting to the US. Yeah, including the rest of Europe and parts of Africa for sure. So it's interesting here that they're taking a slightly different tactic than Elon Musk is. Fewer satellites, a little bit higher up. But Elon Musk is way ahead of them. He's already providing, and they're talking about the UK here, Elon Musk already has beta customers in the UK, he's got beta customers in the US, and it's going to be really hard for anybody to catch up with what he's doing. And this is a story from PC Magazine. Who needs Starlink internet? These rural US counties topped the list. So PC Magazine did a little study of where they thought people would benefit most from Elon Musk's satellite offering. Currently in beta, Starlink has been getting rave reviews. A lot of people are very happy with it that have it. And one reason is they had really crummy service before. They might have had satellite from a geostationary satellite service, which is 30,000 plus miles in the air versus 350 miles or so. So latency is really bad. Speeds are not nearly what it is that you get with Starlink. So they may have had that. They may have had DSL. They may have had no service other than cell service. So they're very happy, and they're getting good speeds. They're getting like hundreds of megabits per second from the satellite with very low latency, latency that compares with really good wired broadband service. It says, for this story, we combined Ookla data, that would be speed data, with census and climate data to find the US counties that need Starlink the most and are best suited to benefit from it. We started with places where internet service is poor, and that's where this is really going to take off. I mean, if you're sitting at home with a fiber connection or a good cable connection, even good fixed wireless connection, you're probably not going to go out and get Starlink service. You're going to want to need it. You're going to need it, basically. You're going to want to have it. So we started with places where internet service is poor. All the counties on our map have median home download speeds below 25 megabits per second, and 25 megabits per second is the FCC's minimum definition of broadband. So they're saying this is below the FCC's definition of broadband. And we filtered for counties with fewer than 100 people per square mile. So they're looking at areas that are not densely populated, where it's going to be harder to justify a wired service like fiber. Satellite internet services don't do well at handling a large number of subscribers in a small area because they have limited capacity per satellite. So they're saying they're saying two things here. One is, fewer than 100 people per square mile is probably where the service is going to be most accepted, because again, if there's more than that, or the more people you have, the more likely it is that you're going to have good wired service because there's more customers to pay for service. So therefore, a telephone company or a cable company is going to be more likely to make the investment to provide good service there. But they're saying that you can't have a lot of customers on these satellites, and that's probably true. Although that's one reason why SpaceX is launching so many satellites, because they want to have that capacity. So this is not just like one satellite up there that's going to be handling all of this traffic. These are going to be constellations of satellites that are going to be handling this traffic and then beaming everything back down to Earth, getting the bandwidth to Earth, from Earth, that kind of thing. Let's see, we filtered out the 500 counties with the highest median monthly rainfall, which is interesting. They say the 12 gigahertz frequency band that Starlink uses is known to have rain fade, getting weaker in the rain, although commentators on Reddit say they've had good experiences in all weather. So again, I don't think this is going to be like your DirecTV or your Dish TV where it starts to rain and then suddenly your TV goes out. Again, these are constellations of satellites. These antennas that they use, the little UFO-shaped antenna, the terminal that they have is a phased array antenna, so it's not mechanical. It actually uses this phased array antenna inside, so it can switch from, as these constellations fly across the sky, it can switch from satellite to satellite, and that's how it maintains a constant internet connection. And I would assume that there's probably going to be some kind of technology in there where if it's having an issue hitting a satellite due to rain or something like that, it can maybe shift to another one. So I don't think, and the people on Reddit say they haven't had an issue with that. That gave us 253 rural counties across the U.S. in the right latitude band, with the right weather, where people are in need of the fastest internet service promised by Starlink. So you can see he's got a good opportunity here. And this is showing just this portion of the country, probably based on what he can cover now, considering that he's not launched all the satellites that he wants to launch. So he's kind of got it cut off here at the Mason-Dixon line, so to speak, somewhere like north to south. Spanning a range from Oregon to Maine, they represent about 3.7 million Americans stuck with abysmal internet service. It's also clear that more fertile territory will appear in the southern states once the service becomes more easily available there. So he's been launching, I think it's 80 satellites at a time at a pretty good clip, so it won't be long before he'd be able to reach these areas as well. And this shows the top 20 best counties for Starlink and where they're located right here. The winner, or really the loser, is Adams County, Idaho, where the biggest town is Council. Too many people are grinding along with old-school satellite from HughesNet and Viasat if they can get any internet access at all, according to Broadband Now. So again, HughesNet, Viasat, geostationary satellite, 30,000 plus miles in the air, very high latency, and the speeds are not the best. Most populated county of this bunch is Tehama County, California, more than 65,000 inhabitants. Not residents, but inhabitants. Spectrum high-speed internet is available in the town of Red Bluff, but speed test numbers reveal that the vast majority of county residents are grinding along at speeds much lower than that. So satellite internet is coming, and it's coming to help some of these folks. And then finally, let's talk a little bit about RDOF in California again. We were just talking about California there with being a county that needs some satellite internet, and this shows that they top the RDOF bucks per rural resident. So this is the Rural Development Opportunity Fund. This is a reverse auction that was completed recently, which is providing funds to service providers, whether it be telephone companies, cable companies, anybody laying fiber, wireless, whatever, to be able to provide internet in some of these really rural, unserved or underserved areas, starting out with unserved. Rural residents in California got the most money for broadband in the FCC's RDOF auction at $830 per resident, while Rhode Island got the least with only $9. It's interesting that California, it's not really a rural area, but there are rural areas of California, and it's a big state. West Virginia was second most at $530, followed by Arkansas with $377, Minnesota with $328, and Massachusetts with $327. It's surprising with Massachusetts. I don't think of that small state. You don't think of it as being very rural. Among the lowest, New Jersey, that's not that surprising, was second. Actually, there's a lot of rural areas in New Jersey. It's a farm state. A lot of it is farm area. Just a small percentage of it is what we think of as New Jersey. New Jersey was second at $13 per rural resident. Connecticut, third least at $23, followed by New Hampshire with $50 per rural resident, and North Dakota at $53. That's surprising. The auction allocated $9.2 billion for rural broadband build-outs over the next 10 years. It has a build-out requirement, including reaching all assigned locations completed by the end of 6 years. While services of at least the FCC's 25 by 3 downstream, upstream definition was eligible for the money, the FCC prioritized bids for higher speeds and lower latency. And they did that prioritization through a weighted average. They gave incentives for people that were going to bid for gigabit speeds, not just gigabit, but lower than that, but gigabit speeds, and actually the vast majority of the people that won money committed to deploying gigabit. So the vast majority are actually going to be doing this through fiber or a combination of wireless and fiber. So that's what you've seen is some of the larger winners from this were actually wireless providers, but they've come out and said, hey, while we're a wireless provider, we're also going to be doing most of this with fiber. We're going to be doing wireless for backhaul, that kind of thing. So, and then it says here, I didn't highlight it, but somewhat surprisingly, North Dakota got some of the least funding per rural resident, $53, even though almost 40% of the state's population is rural. Now, North Dakota is one that is prime for satellite service, so they don't, they'll have something here fairly soon with SpaceX, and SpaceX bid heavily in RDOF, so they're getting funds for RDOF. There was a lot of pushback on that because people were saying, well, they're not really a rural provider. They can provide service anywhere, but where they're most likely, again, going to have an impact and most likely going to have people take their services in rural areas. So maybe some of those funds will go, and the reason people were upset was because it's not specifically paying for, you're going to lay fiber in this rural area. They're saying the satellites are already up there. They can shoot that beam anywhere, but they still have to get the service to people, and it needs to be affordable. So some of that money may go to making the terminal affordable, because I think it's like a $400 or $500 antenna that you need to get. That phased array antenna is fairly complex. So maybe some of the funds will go to help people afford that, and maybe provide some subsidies. Maybe they'll provide lower prices to people in rural areas as part of that. I don't know what they're planning on using that for. So, all right, well, that's it right now for broadband funding. There's going to be I'm assuming there's going to be a lot more news on this Biden infrastructure plan, because right now, like I say, he's out there trying to sell it as his administration, and on the other side of the aisle, they're trying to put the brakes on that because of the amount of money. And I don't think they're so much worried about $100 billion in broadband. I think what they're worried about is the rest of the money, the almost $3 trillion or so, or however much it turns out to be, that's for other things that are in this package that are not necessarily related to infrastructure. So I think there's going to be back and forth on this. I think the broadband stuff won't be as affected by that, although the details will be. So I think the amount of money may not be in question, but maybe some of the details, maybe some of this with the municipal internet, maybe some things about, what are you talking about on pricing? Are you going to talk about fixing pricing? Anything that's more on the side of socialism and less on the side of capitalism is probably going to be argued by the Republicans on their end. So we'll just have to see how that goes. But thanks for joining me. If this was helpful, go ahead and click the little subscribe button. And when you click subscribe, you'll see the little bell there. Click the bell, and you'll be notified anytime I am live, and that's once a week, every Tuesday. So I will see you next time for Tech Tuesday. Take care. Have a good week. Bye-bye.